So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Brexit being the cause of a lot of more, huge increase in channel crossings, and this is hilarious because all of these people talked about taking back control, and all they did was give away control to people smugglers.
Story, and he joined.
Bad audio warning, guys.
Is now outside at the Skypad. Sam.
This is the week that the government puts forward its plans to overhaul legal and illegal migration because it's considered by many members of the public to be out of control. But the question we're asking today is the manner in which we left the European Union back in 2020, did that actually contribute to problems on our borders and mean that more people came in than the public could tolerate? Now, this isn't a question that Tories have previously raised problems with our Brexit deal because they were so often told things like this.
Illegal immigration.
So, you've got there a very clear sign that Minister Dean...
Yeah, Sky needs to fire the sound guy over this.
...not want to talk about the downsides at the time. But, Sophie, I want to talk about this. He is Chris Philp. He's the Shadow Home Secretary, and he really matters in this debate because he was also the immigration minister at the point that Britain was leaving the European Union and all its structures. And in a leaked recording of a meeting that he held with Tory members at the end of April, so really, really recently, he appeared to suggest that actually the way that we left the EU, the way that that Brexit deal was negotiated, did cause problems. Now, he's about to refer in the recording I'm going to play you to something called the Dublin Arrangements. That's the EU-wide agreement that means that people inside the bloc can transfer and remove asylum seekers back to the country where they first applied if they've gone on somewhere else.
So I think it's more the people that have travelled through. So like, I don't think it's the case that you can send, if someone applies in France, get it rejected, goes to the UK, and you can then send them back to France. I think it's more for it's the safe country that they arrive from. I think it's more aimed at that.
He appears to suggest that leaving the EU and leaving that arrangement is a problem. Listen to what he had to say.
Now, because we're out of the European Union now, we are out of the Dublin III regulations, and so we can't any longer rely on sending people back to the place where they first claimed asylum. When we did check it out, just before we exited the EU transitional arrangements on December the 31st, 2020, we did run some checks and found that about half the people crossing the Channel had claimed asylum previously elsewhere in Europe, in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, somewhere like that, and therefore could have been returned. But now we're out of Dublin, we can't do that, and that's why we need to have somewhere like Rwanda that we can send these people to as a deterrent.
So I'm not going to lie, Batman would not have got that first half out of me if I was a Conservative, but, he admitted it that, Brexit has basically caused this, because there was no way for us to keep the Dublin III agreement when we left the EU.
Now, I think that's interesting, partly because he appears to admit that they were still doing research on exactly what would happen just before we left the European Union and all of its structures late on. So it sounds like quite a lot of last-minute decision-making. But it's also interesting because that absolutely wasn't the story that we were told at the time. Now, in what you just heard from a few weeks ago, Chris Philp was suggesting that the Dublin Agreement was a good thing. Now listen to how he talked about it at the time, back in 2020.
The Dublin regulations do have a number of constraints in them, which makes returning people who should be returned a little bit harder than we would like. Of course, come the 1st of January, we'll be outside of those Dublin regulations, and the United Kingdom can take a fresh approach.
Yeah, a fresh approach that just isn't working. The Rwanda scheme was a complete red herring. It was just a way to try and get out of the ECHR.
So is this part of the Conservative Party throwing its hands up and saying that it got bits of the Brexit deal wrong? What is it going to say? Well, I asked the Conservative Party for a response, and it emerged, I have to say, it is quite lengthy. They take a lot of positions. They say they did Brexit because the public wanted it, but they did have a plan, and even Chris Philp, they say, wasn't suggesting otherwise, and that they struck lots of agreements, but they need to go even further in order to deal with...
Further and faster, the Conservative Party.
...the problem. So, in some ways, the Conservatives are not sure whether or not they should agree with Chris Philp publicly or not.
Well, they shouldn't, because the whole what Chris Philp had said is, whilst we're a member of the EU, we didn't have this issue that much, whereas now we do because of Brexit. Like, it's not hard to figure out that one.
A little bit of a mess. Clearly, Brexit, a sensitive issue for the Conservative Party. Labour aren't hanging around. This is Mike Tapper, Labour MP.
Demonstrates here that Chris Philip, who was the immigration minister at the time, was saying something completely different behind closed doors and not being honest with the public. Of course, we know we've inherited a really difficult situation. I think it's time for an apology.
Yeah, but you know, it is time for an apology, but what are you going to do about it? Because you're trying to set up agreements with like Albania and other countries to set up return hubs. Like, it doesn't make sense. So you can demand an apology, but you're the big man now. You guys are in charge. It's time for you to step up and do something. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Oh, we've got the Chris Phillips quote, to be fair. I might as well play it.
Well, the Dublin regulations do have a number of constraints in them, which makes returning people who should be returned a little bit harder than we would like. Of course, come the 1st of January, we'll be outside of those Dublin regulations, and the United Kingdom can take a fresh approach.
So, you know, he does admit, like, despite the constraints, or, you know, I think the constraints are fairly minimal, to be honest with you. But, yeah, it does go to show you that the Conservative Party basically admitted that, you know, whilst we're members of the EU, this wasn't a problem, and then it became a problem because of them. Like, the whole Rwanda stuff was made because of Brexit. So it does show you, like, how important the EU is, and, you know, the kind of things that we don't really hear about too much in terms of certain conventions can be really important for countries, and, you know, we've lost access to that, and that's on us. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.